God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. God only knows how it's killing you. But there's a kind of love that God only knows. God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. But God only knows the real you. There's a kind of love that God only knows.
Welcome to the fourth episode of Your Journey is Not Over. My name is Tanya Pearson Randolph. This is my own personal journey. The expressions and opinions are of my own. I own all the rights to my personal journey, and to your journey is not over. Neither are to be used, edited, copied in any way without my consent. Now let's get started. I've thought about my brother's trauma a lot since his suicide in January. I'm not here to discuss his journey at all, but I will say I know what we experienced together, which somehow made it easier to always know, no matter what, we had each other. I can only imagine what he had to endure and go through those 6 years before I was born. As I was again told, my brother and I lived with our grandparents, and our mother was in another state, working, living her life. Of course, I got yanked out several times as a power move towards my grandparents. I often think how painful that must have been for my grandparents. Here I was a baby. When I say I was the baby of the entire family, I was. And I had health issues, and they knew I would be here, there, and everywhere, and Lord knows what kind of care I would receive in the custody of my mother. Let's just say nothing slowed her roll when it came to going out drinking and dancing. She did work, I have to, and I've always gave her that credit and respect. But she also enjoyed her nights out. At my grandparents' house, it was full of love, faith in God, good food, and lots of family, always in and out. Some were aunts and uncles, some were great aunts and uncles, some were cousins, some were second cousins. Not to mention family lived so close together down there. I don't know if where we lived was called a holler or not. I just know there was a lot of family always around, and it was nice and normal to me. I do have the second cousin who has always been like a big sister to me. She definitely gave me someone to look up to my whole life. But she tells me the cutest stories of changing my diapers and carrying me around on her hip. She always says in the cutest way, to protect you. If you were on my hip, I knew you were safe. It always melts my heart to hear her say how she wanted to protect me. She knew I needed it. An angel that I was born with and have always loved and admired, not only as a person, also as a woman that survived our family and is an amazing mother and grandmother, and most of all, has a love for God like nobody I've ever seen. I do have to mention this before I get back to my journey. When I do see her, which is not as often as I need to, she always kicks in and treats me like her baby. And there have been times that she feeds me, like French fries, for instance. She is always preying on my French fries as she's putting them in my mouth, which I love and admire so much for her loving me, protecting me, and giving me someone to always look up to. She knows who she is, and I love you so very much. Another thing I want to mention during this part is I don't think people realize I was raised a generation older by being raised by my grandparents. Some people have told me I'm a bit old fashioned, or the most common that I hear is I'm old school. That's kind of what happens when you spend your first 5 years with the older generation. You are what you are taught. During this, I never remember my grandparents ever saying anything bad about raising my brother and I. What I do remember is my grandmother stressing, Tanya Ann, if you ever have kids, you are to raise them, in which I did, both of my kids. Not too many women in my family raise their own children. It's almost like a family tradition. They have the kids, and then somebody else raises them. And for instance, once I was grown, then my mother wanted to take credit for every single thing. Another what seems like a family tradition. My mother never appreciated if I gave my grandma an ounce of credit for everything she did do for my brother and I. That would always result in an argument. Almost like it busted up her fairy tale in her mind that, she did it all by herself with no help at all. Again, just that, a fairy tale in her mind. Back to my journey. My brother and I lived with our grandparents until I was almost 5. Then my grandparents moved north, where all of our family had already moved, for better jobs and a better way of living. Coal mining in the lumber yards, and of course moonshining, paid the bills, but didn't leave much for extra. So everyone was moving north. By this time, my mother had met someone and married him. So then my brother and I had to go live with them. At this time, I was adopted by her husband. So the maiden name I have now is not the name I was born with. I was born Tanya Ann South. Then it got changed to Tanya Ann Pearson. I remember some things about this time. I couldn't stop missing my grandma, and I couldn't wait for Sundays. Church with her, and a huge family get together with the best Southern food. Of course, what I was raised on. But I got to see both of my grandparents. I remember a time when my older cousin and I were at my grandparents' house and we were in the restroom and I got choked on a lifesaver. I remember my grandpa beating on the door for her to unlock it. Finally, she did. And he yanked me up quick and started pounding on my back. Of course, saved me. I also remember my grandma telling me that on a trip with them north, my grandpa had to pull over on the interstate because I got choked on a dime. He always seemed to save me. Shortly after they moved north, my grandpa passed away and my grandma was alone. My brother and I were living with our mother and her husband. I do remember feeling confused about the rules. We couldn't have anything at all to drink while we were eating. Had to wait till after we ate every single thing on our plates, which sometimes would take me hours. That's a rule that I still don't understand. And my brothers, my older brother, and my adopted brother, which by the way, I never use the word adopted when it comes to him. I only did that during this so you, the listeners, would understand. I now have another older brother that we get to see every other weekend. I always thought he was the lucky one. He got to go home to the sweetest mom and didn't have to endure the nightmare full time like me and my brother had to. My brothers would sneak my food off of my plate and eat it for me, especially if they knew I couldn't eat it. Many times I remember literally throwing up because I was forced to eat something I did not like. And lots of times I would be sitting at the table after everyone was done, and the dishes were done, and the kitchen was dark, and still couldn't make myself eat certain things. Things sure were different for us, completely different. It wasn't long before the real trauma and nightmares began. Let's just say they were both drinkers, and not nice drugs. Always fighting, hollering, cussing, and screaming. Not what I was used to at all. I don't believe I ever heard my grandma say a cuss word my whole life. I can remember many times my brothers having to drive us home because they were too drunk to drive. Of course, both of my brothers too young to drive and too small to drive. So one would do the brakes and the gas and the other would do the steering. I have vivid memories of sitting in the back seat and watching my brothers and being scared to death. Because of these memories, I'm petrified of being in a car crash now. Again, God had his hand on us each and every time. I remember being dragged out of bed many, many times to go to a bar parking lot. A few of these times it was so cold and snowy outside. My brother and I would crawl in the back of our mother's Vega and snuggle close together to stay warm. My big brother was always so protective of me. I always remembered that when we would get back home, most of the time, they were drunk and fighting and arguing. And is where I remember the physical violence starting. First, it was between them, and we were just scared bystanders. But eventually, it turned on us too. In order to get back and hurt our mother, her husband would come home drunk and take off his belt. Mind you, the 1970s belt buckles were huge. And we would be woke up from a dead sleep getting beat with his belt. Imagine the nightmare of waking up to this. I remember when I was in the third grade, that exact thing happened. It was a brutal beating, and I had to walk around for weeks with my right arm broken in 3 places. My bone was almost out of the skin on the wrist area. I do remember the night before being made to pull up a chair and do dishes, and I remember the pain of washing the cups. It was so painful. It wasn't until I dropped my chair at school the very next morning. My teacher, who became a mentor and a mother figure to me until the day she passed away, took notice of my arm. She sent me to what I called the army nurse, our school nurse. My mother was made to come and get me and take me to the hospital. Again, it was broken 3 places from the wrist to the elbow. I think back to that time and I wonder what was the delay in taking me? Was it to cover up the abuse? Or was it the inconvenience of taking me to the hospital? My mother didn't like to slow her roll for unnecessary things like that. There were a lot of beatings in the middle of the night, and most of the time after we got beat, then he would turn his anger on her. So we would scatter out the door to the neighbors to get help. Many times this happened. Sometimes the cops would come. We would leave with our mother. We would go God knows where in the middle of the night, sleep in her car until whatever family member woke up the next morning, and then straight back into the same destructive cycle, as if the tear and the abuse never happened. Again, swept under the rug. It happens so often that the neighbors quit answering their doors for us in the middle of the night. Because of this, I truly believe now this is where my bad nerves and my OCD started. Again, perceptions are so off. Again, people that think they knew me, or should I say know of me, think that I have everything all figured out. I'm the girl with such confidence, and I have it all under control, or at least it seems that way. Because of this perception, again, the word perception, there have been people that have came into my life with the main purpose to knock me down a few notches, or how it's been put to me to put me in my place, whatever that means. I guess the perception of my confidence bothers people about me. Remember, I'm walking on sunshine, right? Let me let everyone in on a little secret. I don't have it all figured out. I walk around scared to death most of the time. Again, I was always taught never to show fear. But to make decisions, I second guess myself, sometimes 2 or 3 times. And I'm very precise, and I think things through completely before I make decisions. Do I always make the right decision? No, Lord, no. But there's always lessons that come with bad decisions. So you have to live and learn, and you take the bad with the good. And please, never judge a book by her cover. The facts are in the chapters. This concludes my podcast for today. As always, thank you all for listening, for the support, and for the love from everybody, and for everybody that has reached out to me. Please join me Thursday for our 5th podcast. Until next time, please remember your journey is not over. God bless.
God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. God only knows how it's killing you. But there's a kind of love that God only knows.